turn off the cooking and all of that, everything is heard
To
here.
bring an end to the fighting.
The timing is
to come
perfect.
to a political resolution of your country. I know it is.
All of the cooking
I
is
think
being heard here,
everybody fully
Mother.
understands that it is easier said than done.
Mr. President, I'm happy to hear today from you that you participate our peace steps to the peace. That's real thing what really want our people, just to bring peace to our homes. To yes, and thank you for participation of peace summit. That's very strong signal. Like I said, we have for today more than 100 countries.
This isn't the first time that the Philippines has extended its support to Ukraine under President Marcos. Last year, the Philippines voted along with 140 countries to demand that Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine. February this year, the country renewed its support for Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine is also hoping to open an embassy in Manila this year.
Following today's meeting, Zelenskyy posted on X saying, "I am grateful to the Philippines for supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, for its clear position on Russia's aggression against our country, and for supporting important UN resolutions." He also said, "We discussed the inaugural Global Peace Summit and the importance of Southeast Asian countries being represented there. I am pleased the Philippines will participate in the summit." The summit is being organized by Switzerland and will be held next month, though there is no official confirmation yet from Malacanang about whether or not Marcos is going.
Now, the two heads of state were not able to meet at the Shangri-La Forum, as we mentioned earlier, but both of them mentioned China during their respective plenary sessions. Zelenskyy went so far as to accuse China of pressuring other countries not to attend the upcoming peace summit.
Наш жаль, користуючись.
Unfortunately, Russia using China's influence in the region. Using Chinese diplomats does everything to disrupt the peace summit. Unfortunately, such a big, independent, and powerful country like China is an instrument in the hands of Putin.
I was so surprised to see the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy show up in Manila in very casual clothes with heavy security.
Well, he's known for his casual clothes. He showed up to the Shangri-La dialogue wearing the same thing. But it was all hush-hush, that's right. Even the media weren't informed until the very last minute.
Maybe because of security issues.
Correct.
Also.
It is because of security
But
issues.
he was seen to be drumming up support for that Global Peace Summit in Switzerland in June, which he says that Russia has been undermining and China has kind of aided them on that. That's what he said.
Well, Russia's not going to be part of that summit. And so, according to him, there's at least 100 countries now that have committed to going to that Global Peace Summit.
And it's already been
But
more than
Russia
2
is not invited to
China is not attending, but they say it's because it isn't supported by both Russia and Ukraine.
Well,
Interesting.
It has been more than 2 years since the invasion.
February
And
24, 2022, exactly, is the day when Russia invaded Ukraine.
So that's 2 years and 3 months to be exact. Still not about to stop. And again, Zelenskyy did say that Ukraine needs more mental health workers for its soldiers, with President Bongbong Marcos promising to help and welcoming a decision by Ukraine to open an embassy here in Manila this year, which will hasten efforts to deliver assistance to our torn Ukraine.
I remember this was one of the first challenging questions thrown at President Bongbong Marcos upon his inauguration. Tinanong siya parang what was his stance in this
on the war. Because
yeah.
that's right.
And
because
I remember he sided with Ukraine at the very start. So ito nagpapasalamat si Vladimir Zelenskyy. But I've read also it is because of the warming of ties between the Philippines and Russia during the Duterte administration. I guess that's why also the president made an effort to come here to the Philippines.
It has been clear, as we laid out in the timeline earlier, the Philippines' position on the war in Ukraine has been pretty clear from the start. The DFA has made that very, very clear. There's also, I was going to share with you one interesting little tidbit between the two gentlemen, which is that they were both on Times Person of the Year. Zelenskyy was Times 2022 Person of the Year, whereas President Marcos was among the 100 influential people of 2024.
To be fair,
So
President Duterte also made it to those time lists.
that is true. And so did President Trump, but we're not talking about them. We're talking about the two
Vladimir
gentlemen.
Putin.
Yeah, and you know,
Vladimir
from all indications, they seem to have a very good, amiable, congenial meeting.
Right. Wait, guys, speaking of China, there has been, or there was, another incident apparently. The Inquirer first reported that the Chinese Coast Guard was caught seizing and throwing overboard supplies meant for Philippine troops stationed at the BRP Sierra Madre. Footage released by China's own state media shows that it was the Chinese Coast Guard that first approached the Filipinos. But instead, China used this video to accuse Filipino soldiers of threatening them with guns. Gio Robles with the rest of that story.
This is the new video China released allegedly showing Filipino soldiers stationed at the BRP Sierra Madre in Ayungin Shoal pointing guns at them. The incident allegedly occurred on May 19 during an airdrop resupply mission. The 30-second video released by a Chinese state-controlled media showed the airdrop of supplies to the BRP Sierra Madre. In the next shot, a Chinese inflatable boat is seen approaching the grounded ship. This was when Philippine soldiers stood on deck of the BRP Sierra Madre, appearing alert as they observed the approaching Chinese rubber boat. Chinese media accused the Filipino personnel of holding guns that they pointed at the Chinese Coast Guard, though this allegation was not captured in the footage. Aside from this incident, a ranking military official who refused to be named claimed that the Chinese Coast Guard seized the food and other supplies meant for Filipino troops on BRP Sierra Madre. These supplies were then thrown in the water. China also allegedly blocked or obstructed the medical evacuation of ailing Filipino soldiers. The AFP has yet to release a statement on the incident. But based on the 2016 arbitral ruling, China's rampant patrols in the Ayungin Shoal are illegal, especially as the area falls under the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Chinese and Philippine ships have collided several times in Ayungin and other parts of the West Philippine Sea. China cited this as the reason why they are now running out of patience. In the 21st Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore this weekend, Chinese Defense Minister said China has maintained sufficient restraint in the face of rights infringements and provocation, but noted that there are limits to this. Though China did not name any state or official, it can be recalled that President Bongbong Marcos in the same forum declared that the Philippines will not yield to threats to its sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea.
As president, I have sworn to this solemn commitment from the very first day that I took office. I do not intend to yield. Filipinos do not yield.
Marcos also stressed that his administration will do whatever it takes to protect our sovereign home. For News 5, Gio Robles, we are One News.
Heard those lines from the president, and as expected, President Marcos's keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore generated headlines all over the world. For the most part, foreign news outlets highlighted his pushback of Beijing in his speech. He was widely quoted by everyone from the BBC to the Nikkei to Bloomberg and CNN for calling out China's aggression and for laying down a red line. That red line, as what he told the packed ballroom, is when a Filipino, whether a serviceman or an ordinary citizen, is killed through a willful act by China.
If a Filipino citizen is killed by a willful act, that is, I think, very, very close to what we define as an act of war, and therefore we will respond accordingly. And our treaty partners, I believe, also hold that same standard for when the actions with the joint action will be undertaken in support of any such incident in the Philippines. But once we get to that point, that is certainly, we would have crossed the Rubicon. Certainly crossed the Rubicon. Is that a red line? Almost certainly it's going to be a red line.
Except U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was asked the next day whether he was on the same page as Marcos and whether the U.S. would view the death of a Filipino an act of war too. And Secretary Austin evaded the question.
I won't speculate on any hypothetical situation. What I would say, though, is that what we are doing and what we continue to try to do is to make sure that that doesn't happen. And by increasing dialogue between, major powers and and making sure that countries are working together to promote freedom of the seas and freedom of the skies. That will narrow the possibility that this happens. I will continue to emphasize that our commitment to the Mutual Defense Treaty is ironclad.
After his keynote, Austin met with his counterpart, Defense Secretary Gibo Chodoro, on Saturday for a formal bilateral meeting. The two updated each other on the progress made by both countries since the recent Squad meeting in Hawaii. The DND also quoted Austin as saying during the meeting, and I quote, "We are beyond friends and allies. We are family. What affects you affects us."
To help us unpack all of these, we have with us on the show tonight Richard Haydarian. He's senior lecturer at the UP Asian Center, and of course, our resident geopolitical and international affairs expert. Good evening, Richard. Thanks for being with us again.
Good evening, guys.
Where are you? Are you here? Are you in Manila?
Yeah, finally. Catch up tayo.
That was daylight.
I know you're always all over the globe, speaking here, talking there. So thanks for being with us. Listen, the first thing I wanted to ask you was about that soundbite from Secretary Austin, not wanting to address the question of what will constitute what would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. I mean, it's a global, it's a incredibly high level forum, so much media attention on there. He keeps talking about how the U.S. commitment to the Philippines is ironclad. And don't you think that would have been the perfect time to reiterate that and be, and to echo what President Marcos has said about, what the red line is, which is that if a Filipino were, through a willful act, killed in disputed waters. So what did you make of that? Or are we just, making a mountain out of a molehill here?
Well, I used to quite regularly attend the Shangri-La Dialogue, especially in the pre-pandemic years, when U.S. and China had effective communication channels. And I think there were a lot of occasions when the Americans were quite open about the parameters or extent of their bilateral relationship. As far as that question is concerned, President Biden, no less than President Biden himself, has been very clear about this, and also Secretary of State Antony Blinken, that any attack on Philippine public vessels, meaning both Coast Guard and also Philippine Navy forces, will automatically trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. So I don't think there was a need for Austin to make any further clarification, since Biden himself, the American Commander-in-Chief, did that. Let's not forget, he came to this Shangri-La Dialogue, though, because, among other things, he had a chance to talk to his Chinese counterpart. So the former Chinese defense minister, we don't know what happened to him. The same thing with the former Chinese foreign minister. A lot of purge, a lot of domestic upheavals is happening as far as chain of command is concerned in China. So in this venue, I think Secretary Austin's priority was not to make fireworks, right? And to make sure he creates the conditions for a substantive dialogue with his Chinese counterpart. Because this is the worrying thing. Over the past 18 months, essentially, the two defense chiefs of China and the United States have not had any formal meeting. And that finally happened, of course, last week in the Shangri-La Dialogue. So I think his priority was to work on ways to rebuild that communication channels, while also reiterating that his focus right now is deterrence. Why should we even talk about what will the U.S. do when war happens, when the U.S. can help the Philippines as early as now to make sure China will not even dare to engage in something funny? So I think that's my understanding of why he said it's hypothetical, when Biden and Blinken were very clear about, even in that hypothetical, the Mutual Defense Treaty will apply.
So this shouldn't be seen as a wavering of the U.S.'s commitment to the Philippines.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you cannot go higher than Biden, right? And that's what he clarified during the Japan-Philippine-U.S. JAFOS Trilateral Summit in Washington, D.C. the other month. And if you look at the discussions that the Squad had, the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines, also in Hawaii a few weeks ago, it was also a discussion about how can they help the Philippines to better uphold its territorial integrity and sovereign rights in the area. So no, I wouldn't read too much into it. In fact, to be honest, this question keeps on coming up every year. So I hope people will not ask the same question over and over again, and have more interesting questions in Shangri-La Dialogues nowadays.
Okay, well, as we we know, Richard, of course, President Marcos had the stage for the very first time. The Philippines had the stage for the very first time. And conversely to U.S. Secretary Austin, he made some very, very strong statements at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He did say, of course, the Philippines will not yield. We will defend the Philippines at all costs. Let's run a soundbite to refresh all our memories from that speech.
So the lines that we draw in our waters are not derived from just our imagination, but from international law. We have on our side the 1982 UNCLOS and the binding 2016 arbitral award, which affirms what is ours by legal right. As president, I have sworn to this solemn commitment from the very first day that I took office. I do not intend to yield. Filipinos do not yield.
The thoughts on the spiciness of her president's statements on that stage, Richard? Of course, he did say he had a lot more sound bites than that. But let's work through that one first. Were you shocked at how he had so explicitly said things in that platform to that audience, or was it just about what you expected?
Well, it looks like it's the same speechwriter that he did also a speech for the Australian Parliament. Remember, a few months ago, he was for a state visit to Australia, and he made also exactly the same thing. He said Filipinos do not yield, and that what he's doing in the West Philippines say it's not a reflection of his personal preference, it's a reflection of his mandate to the Filipino people, especially when surveys are saying 70-80% of Filipinos want the current direction of our foreign policy, which is standing up to China, resisting the bullying there in the West Philippines. I think in fairness to President Marcos Jr., he tried to create a balance because he's very conscious. He's invited by Singapore, a country that tries to have a neutral relationship with both superpowers, at least on the surface, performatively, although much of Singapore's weapon system is from the West and the US. There are also other ASEAN countries there. So the strategy of China coming into this conference was to paint the Philippines as the deputy sheriff of America and to paint us as the anomaly in ASEAN. So that's why President Marcos Jr. correctly said, we don't want to choose between the two superpowers. It's important for both superpowers to be part of a constructive and inclusive order, that the peace and prosperity in this part of the world depends on the two superpowers. But at the same time, he also made it clear that, quote unquote, it's a permanent fact, he said, that China wants to achieve a certain kind of hegemony in this part of the world. He didn't mention the word hegemony, but he said a kind of influence that allows China to determine our economic and geopolitical future here. That's why you need America to counterbalance China. So I think it was a very eloquent and I think a very comprehensive speech whereby he made it clear that the Philippines is not the aggressor here. We're not the troublemaker here. We respect our Southeast Asian partners and ASEAN fellows who want to have a balanced relationship. We would love to have the same thing, but we cannot have a friendly relationship with countries who are not friendly to us. We want to be friend to everyone, but we cannot be friends to those who act like enemies to us. So in that sense, I think it was a very balanced speech, and I think the president deserves commendation because if you look at the Chinese delegation, it was like a troll army, right? They're not asking questions. If you look at throughout the Shangri-La Dialogue, there were all these generals and colonels from China who would just go ranting. They're not there asking questions. They would just try to rant and paint China as the victim and paint the Philippines and the West and everyone as conspiratorial and trying to contain them, supposed Asian NATO. So, and I don't think they did the good, diplomacy for themselves. I think they just painted themselves as a completely isolationist and self-referential, if not narcissistic superpower, which doesn't want to respect other countries' point of view, including smaller countries like the Philippines. And them pretending to be the lead, as if they're the representative of ASEAN and lecturing Marcos on what the ASEAN does. I'm not sure that went well with a lot of our ASEAN partners.
Actually, you're right. The first person who asked President Marcos a question after his speech was General Xu Hui, who, I should point out, is the commandant of the Chinese Military's International College of Defense Studies. And you're right, he went on a long preamble about ASEAN centrality before having to be prompted by the IISS Executive Chairman John Shipman about this question. So that's just a little side story.
Yeah, exactly. So I was slightly disappointed. This was a good opportunity for China to show that they're a responsible power. They're here for dialogue. But no, they were just talking to their own domestic audience. I mean, we used to call this wolf warrior diplomacy. And wolf warrior diplomacy was mostly a Chinese foreign ministry phenomenon. Now, seeing Chinese generals in their uniform and all, making threatening statements, painting the Philippines and Taiwan as troublemakers and saying our patience is running out. My goodness, this doesn't reflect well on China. They don't look like a responsible power. They look like a country that wants to impose its will on the rest of the region and has zero respect and contempt for the points of view of other countries, including the Philippines. So, in fairness to Marcos, he held his he held his line and he held his temper. I think if another leader was questioned that way with some whatever general in another country, he would have responded more aggressively. I would have responded more aggressively.
Richard, as we all know, the main audience in that ballroom was Asia. I mean, the ASEAN region was there for sure, well, very well represented. But it also felt like the president was that little brother calling out to everybody in the room, asking to be heard equally as the superpowers, China, United States, and so on and so forth. You think he was also trying to appeal for more support in the ASEAN region? Was that part of the strategy?
Yeah, I think that was definitely part of the strategy to say to the rest of ASEAN, we are one of you. We're not America's deputy, sheriff in ASEAN. We're not the troublemakers here. We're the one being bullied. We're the weaker party, right? And I think China was not very convincing when they tried to paint themselves as the victim and as if there's an Asian NATO forming around them. That is definitely not the case. So I think China was pretty poor in terms of its defense diplomacy, if any diplomacy at all. Well, I think President Marcos Jr. did a pretty decent job of trying to reach out to the rest of the region. But of course, the Shangri Dialogue is a global phenomenon. There are representatives from France, from Britain, from Germany, from many countries all around the region. And I think Marcos was also trying to reach out to those countries. And if you look at the speech of Marcos Jr., it perfectly, jives and syncs with the keynote speeches by previous keynote speaker. For instance, Malcolm Turnbull in 2017, who presented Australia as a bridging power, middle power, who doesn't want to be dictated upon by the superpowers. Speech by Narendra Modi in 2018. Speech the other year by Fumio Kishida of Japan. So if you look at a lot of keynote speakers recently, they don't come from superpower countries. And what they're saying is that no, it's not just two elephants and the rest of us are grass. No. This is a savanna. This is Lion King, right? There are all sorts of different animals, maybe not as big as elephants here, but we have our vision, we have our sovereign rights, and we have to have our voice. So kudos to Singapore for giving the Philippines, a key ASEAN member, this kind of platform. And I think President Marcos Jr. justified that keynote speech with the balanced kind of speech that he gave given circumstances.
Well, my favorite part, apart from the very quotable Filipinos do not yield, my jaw literally dropped while watching when President Marcos said to the US and China, manage your rivalry.
Yeah.
I was shocked to hear him calling out, as what Gretchen said, maybe it's them or us calling out to our big brothers, quote unquote, to help us to get heard. But how do you think what effect would this have with regard to the ASEAN, where we are literally on our own in terms of policy?
Well, I think that quote from Marcos is probably a reason why Lloyd Austin didn't want to talk about scenarios when U.S. will go to war with China, right? And I think that's why Lloyd Austin was relatively tempered in his speech, because U.S. is saying we're open to reopening communication channels. We don't control what Nancy Pelosi did back 2 years ago or 3 years ago, right? So we want these communication channels to be restored. So actually the onus was on China, and I don't think they did a very good job of showing they're the victims here and the US and the rest are aggressors. Now, no, speaking of ASEAN, Cambodia, maybe Laos. Well, Laos is the chairman right now, so they have to be a bit neutral or pretend to do. But the Cambodias and Myanmars and those ones, of course, they're not going to side with us. Of course, they're too dependent on China. But Indonesia and Prabowo, the incoming president, was one of the speakers. Singapore, of course, who invited the Philippines to give the keynote speech. Indonesia, Singapore, these countries are very important, not to mention Vietnam, right? So I think there are certain countries in ASEAN who are very influential, who have global voice, and are at most fence-sitters, and who may be sympathetic to our cause, except they have their own reasons not to be as vocal as us. So there's a part of me suspecting they may Marcos the keynote speaker because they wanted the Philippines to say what they didn't want to say themselves, right? I'm not sure if the Chinese read it that way, but I won't be surprised that was the hidden kind of agenda. Like, let the Filipinos do the dirty job and expose China because perhaps we're not in the mood for that. And Indonesia itself is of course going through a transition, and Singapore just had its own new prime minister recently. So perhaps domestic political transitions may also explain why these countries have been soft pedaling or not as calling out China the way we expect them to. So no, it's not true we're totally alone, but it is true that we're way ahead of everyone else in calling out China, including compared to the Vietnamese.
Well, we're certainly no fence sitters. On your point about China, the Chinese delegation not caring about how they come across during the dialogue, I also wanted to point out the defense minister, Admiral Dong Jun, right, talked about in his speech crushing separatists who try to get in between them and Taiwan, right? So he minced no words. What did you make of that speech?
Yeah, again, isn't it weird that China talks about itself as a victim and Taiwan as the supposed aggressor when they just finalized arguably their biggest and most complex and sophisticated war games all around Taiwan, right? So it's just weird for a country that just conducted these massively intimidating, complex military operations around Taiwan to come out and say, oh, we're the victims and the Taiwanese are the aggressors, right? And just after a week when the new president of Taiwan, Lai, made it clear that he wants the status quo, meaning we're not going to declare independence. It's not true that we're quote-unquote secessionists. We want a status quo whereby we agree to disagree, who is the ultimate China, and we're not going to push for formal independence of Taiwan. So then again, I felt Dong is more talking to his bosses back in Beijing or in the Central Military Commission in Beijing, rather than to the international community. And I think this is worrying. Actually, I'm worried. I'm not happy that China is like this. I think it's worrying because all of us, we grow up on all of this literature that says China is so sophisticated, they can plan for the next 1,000 years. I don't know if they know what they're doing and what are they going to do about the Philippines and Taiwan in the next 30, 60 days. So I'm a bit worried. So my only hope is because parating ng monsoon and mga bagyo, siguro medyo yung mga bubuling na nangyari sa West Philippine Sea will tone down because nature perhaps will force us to de-escalate tensions. So yeah, I think the comments on Taiwan were very,
Right.
weird,
But
right?
to be blunt about it, I wanted to know whether you thought there was signaling that, something imminent might happen, that they were getting closer to annex Taiwan. And let me just read out some of the other quotes from that speech. He said, separatists will be, quote unquote, nailed to the pillar of shame in history and crushed to pieces. So again, very
Yeah.
forceful language there. And I wonder whether you've heard that from him before and what this means possibly for Taiwan in the near future.
The term crushed, that was used already by previous Chinese defense ministers, including not the predecessor immediately, but the other one the other year. So since 2019, we see this optic in rhetoric by President paramount leader Xi Jinping and all top Chinese leaders. So I think that's the rhetoric right now. But my hope is behind the scenes we're seeing a different kind of China, not necessarily chummy, but more reasonable, more statesman-like. So it is possible that there's a double messaging going on here, whereby in international fora, they go wolf warrior and try to impress, folks back home that we're standing up to the world, etc., and impressing Xi Jinping and their bosses. But I'm hoping that behind the scenes, when they talk to their American or Filipino counterparts, they'll say, okay, what do we do here to avoid a war situation? Because realistically, even the latest exercise that China did, if you analyze it, if you talk to the experts, they would say still China is not there. China is not there yet. And China also knows that it's not there yet in terms of the ability to pull off an invasion of Taiwan in a convincing and seamless way. Probably that will take 5 to 10 years from now, also depending on what US and others doing. And everyone is preparing. And on the West Philippine Sea, they also don't want a war. The moment China will have war with a single ASEAN country, no matter what bashing they want to do to the Philippines, no matter how much they want to paint us as, America's little brothers, etc., the reality is that that's going to really strain China's relations. And that's going to spook a lot of other fence-sitters, right? So China has an interest to be responsible, unfortunately not in their public statements, but I hope behind the scenes there's that kind of sense of responsibility. So there was no breakthrough, but I would say also there was no total breakdown because Dong at least made an effort to reach out to have a conversation with his American counterpart. They will say their public stuff, but what I'm looking at is in the coming days and weeks, what are the concrete efforts by U.S. and China to reestablish those frayed military to military communication channels, queues, and other sorts of communication channels? Because this is the last time, I mean, this is the worst time not to have communication channels between the two superpowers, just as tensions rise in Taiwan Straits and South China Sea.
Very good to hear that war may not necessarily be imminent. You've given us plenty of food for thought. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Richard Haydaran, Senior Lecturer at the UP Asian Center.
Thank you.
We're going to be pausing for a quick break for now. Right after that,
Alright, salamat guys. So sorry pinapaano ko kayo dun sa isang well, gladly or not gladly, hindi nila ako tinanong tungkol dun sa visit ni Zelensky. But let me quickly say something about it. So, apparently yung pagbisita ni Zelensky was to Singapore was surprise one. Mukhang may assassination attempt na naman laban sa kanya. There was actually an assassination plot against him that was caught a few days ago. So that's why very very secure yung kanyang very secretive almost yung kanyang travel plans and all of that. Now, for some reason, hindi sila nagabutan ni BBM kasi si BBM may meeting siya with the Singaporean leaders and nandun siya sa Singapore, President of Singapore, new Prime Minister of Singapore. So, it's quite something that Zelensky made an effort to come to the Philippines, no? At kausapin si Bongbong Marcos sa Malacanang mismo. And I posted kanina yung mga pictures sa loob ng Malacanang. I think lapo-lapo yung nasa likod na warrior. So, it just tells you how important the Philippines has become, especially to countries who feel threatened by the authoritarian superpowers. Kasi natutuwa sila sa Pilipinas. We may not have the biggest military in the world, but we have a big mouth, right? We are good in terms of calling things out, and we're also good in terms of our diplomacy, in the sense that we're not alone. We have the Squad, we have JAFUS, we're working with different kind of allies. So, and Ukraine is about to also open a new embassy in the Philippines kasi naalala niyo dati na-interview natin yung Ukrainian ambassador to the Philippines pero actually based siya sa Malaysia. So parang ano lang tayo, backup lang tayo. So now at least they're gonna put an embassy here. So that tells you how important we are. And Philippines is the only country in the entire Southeast Asian region which has consistently voted in favor of Ukraine. And I think there's a logic to that because if China is if Russia is saying, oh, we invade Ukraine because there's NATO expansion and all, and then you suddenly hear China saying, oh, there is an Asian NATO also in our region and US wants to encircle us, connect the dots. What China is saying is, pag sinugod namin ng Taiwan at Pilipinas, oh, wag niyo na akong sisisihin. Ako pa yung biktima. So it's very important that the Philippines works with Ukraine, that Philippines, Taiwan, Ukraine work together and call out this nonsense. Call out this nonsense. I mean, if you're foolish enough to buy Putin's version of history, then I'll tell you what, siguro dapat Mongolia mag-take over ng buong Russia, Northern China, and much of the Middle East, and Turkey, and Ukraine, because there was a time where the Golden Horde, actually more than, 200 years, the Mongolians controlled that entire area. See how ridiculous it sounds if a Mongolian says, oh, but may panahon na lahat ng mga yan ay ari-arian namin. It the same way na sobrang ridiculous when China says, sa amin ang West Philippine Sea at South China Sea kasi dumaan dun si Admiral Zhang ng Ming Dynasty. Do you get what I'm saying? Kaya sobrang syunga yung argument na, oh, Ukraine used to be part of the Russian Empire, blah, 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 so wala silang karapatan maging independent, or wala silang karapatan to make choices on whether they want to join EU or NATO. It's none of Russia's business what Ukraine wants to do about its future. Ukraine is a sovereign nation since the end of Cold War. The Soviet Union has collapsed. If Putin doesn't want to accept it, that's his problem. Right? So, hindi ko maintindihan yung mga iba na sinusupport pa yung Russia, because if you're supporting Russia's argument, then logically, you're also saying tama rin ng China. Kasi 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, they controlled, I don't know, West Philippine Sea daw. So sa kanilang West Philippine Sea. I mean, you can see how ridiculous and dangerous this argument is. And you can see why Philippines and Ukraine and Taiwan are all natural partners. I'm not saying we want, and ito pa yung mas syunga, narinig ko sa mga makapili club and all. Sinasabi nila, oh, we're gonna be like Ukraine. Well, there's two problems with that analogy. First of all, Ukraine humiliated Russia. More than 400,000 Russian casualties. Russia was supposed to be second most powerful military. They invaded entirely Ukraine. And then what? The ones that they're holding on to are mostly what they already had in 2014. So actually, Russia lost close to 500,000 people in casualties and injuries, not to mention they lost trillions of dollars. I mean, Russia is proud that they're growing at 2 to 3%. Russia should grow 7%, 8%. An average Russian's living standard is one-fifth of an average European. Russia is way poorer than Poland, than Hungary, and many of its former satellite states. It should be an embarrassment for Russia to be so poor. I mean, Russia growing at 2%, they're proud of that? That's pathetic. They should be growing at 15%, 10% with all of the resources they have, with all of the benefits that they have. So, yan ang problema ko. And then, Ukraine was invaded because it's not part of NATO. Ukraine was invaded by Russia because it doesn't have a mutual defense treaty. Dahil vulnerable ang Ukraine, kaya sinugot sila. So actually, it works the other way around. Ukraine is a perfect example that if you are a smaller country that doesn't have a backing of a superpower and then you're threatened by another superpower, mag-ingat ka. Your options are submission or being invaded. Well, Philippines is not a neutral country. We're already a treaty ally of another country, which happens to be the most powerful country on earth. And this is the last point I want to say. Tingnan niyo, napahiya yung Russia dun sa Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is a way smaller country than Russia. And look at lahat ng mga Russian tanks, lahat ng mga Russian, bugbog sarado sila sa Ukraine. Yeah, Ukraine is a much smaller country and 10 to 1 ratio ang pinag-usapan natin dito. Look at how gaano ka walang kwenta yung mga Russian weapons kumpara dun sa NATO weapons na ginagamit ng Ukraine. Sobrang walang laban dun sa drones, sa mga ganun. So, Ukraine is 1/10 of Russia and still Russia cannot conquer Ukraine. That just tells you gaano ka bulok din yung mga weapon systems nila compared sa NATO systems. And guess what are the weapon systems in the Philippines? And what are the weapon systems we should get? Right? So, doon ko nagigets na sobrang either walang alam yung mga iba dyan or sobrang ututo lang kayo, nakikinig lang kayo sa propaganda points, or worst, kayo po ay propagandist or bayaran ng mga superpowers na na may agenda laban sa Pilipinas at mga ibang maliliit na bansa. I think it's also very important for President Marcos Jr. to make it clear, hindi rin tayo tuta ng Amerika. And that's why my advice is the Philippines should also be careful. Hindi lang tayo dapat sunod-sunuran sa gusto ng Amerika. We should determine what will be our policy on Taiwan. We should determine what our policy will be on China and West Philippine Sea based on our own national interest. And at the same time, hindi pwede na yung US hanggang bibigyan lang tayo ng mga transport yung mga weapons na gano'n, or Vietnam era stuff. They have to give us top weapon systems if this alliance really makes sense. Kasi isa sa pinakamalaking frustration ko is that yung mga Jordan, Egypt, mga Pakistan of this world, way poorer than us, less developed than us, hindi US ally, hindi democracy, they have Abrams tanks, F-16 fighters, among other advanced weapon systems. We have none of those. So medyo mahina din tayo in terms of leveraging our alliances and all. So, kaya yung mga syunga dyan na nagsabi, si Richard ay pro-gana. Hindi. I just criticize both US and China. Because ang issue dito is how can the Philippines defend its own interests and protect its own interests in the smartest way possible. Hindi tayo dapat, Roy, 500,000 na namatay na Russian, hindi yan, or na-injure na Russian, hindi bugbog sarado sa inyo yan. Napaka-syunga nyo naman. I mean, katulad kayo ng mga nagsasabi na walang namatay na EJK sa panahon ni Dugong. Di ba? Yun ang problema sa yung mga ganyan utak, Pulveronics. Okay. On that note, thank you very much, guys. Maraming salamat. So I'm trying today. Actually, I was supposed to have an interview with a Singaporean professor. Kaso we had to reschedule because of other things. Kasi may interview din tayong iba dahil ito sa Zelenskyy visit and all of that. But hopefully we'll have it later this week. We're also trying to arrange in-person interviews with Tristan, with Mark, para medyo iba naman ang vibes natin. Medyo podcast in-person style, Joe Rogan style. At the same time also, of course, tomorrow, guys, we'll have Justice Carpio again on our little show here, Deep Dive. Pag-usapan natin ang mga latest sa West Philippine Sea, sa foreign policy natin at sa China. On that note, maraming salamat. Whether ikaw ay tuta ng Kremlin, whether ikaw tuta ng Beijing, okay lang yan. Basta makinig kayo. Balang araw, baka medyo mag-level up kayo ng konti. Kung ayaw nyo, problema niyan. To the rest, thank you so much for your continued support. And please don't forget, guys, subscribe lang kayo sa ating mga channels. Libre lang mag-subscribe sa YouTube. Libre lang mag-subscribe sa Spotify Deep Dive with Richard Haydaran. As I said, kailangan natin get as many subscriptions as possible because we have to create that momentum. At you guys know how it works. Yung algorithm sa mga social media platforms is, the more people listen to you, the more you'll be recommended. So, makinig lang kayo, mag-subscribe lang kayo, mas i-recommend tayo ng sistema nila dun sa mga ibang tao so we can spread the word. And of course, I always appreciate if you can spread the word directly and ask other people to rate us, hopefully, 5-star, to recommend us and subscribe to us. So, we have to win the algorithm game, guys. The more we don't watch good stuff, the more we don't support good vloggers, the more the algorithm will recommend the bad vloggers, the buljak vloggers, the marites vloggers, alam nyo na, yung mga ganyan, di ba? So we have to beat those guys. And we have to also beat propaganda, etc. By the way, just to be clear, everything I'm saying here has nothing to do with the great people of Russia and the great people of China. I love Russian literature. I mean, just look at me here behind me. It's like War and Peace, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. I am big fan of Russian literature and culture. I love a lot of their fighters, especially coming from Dagestan and more others, MMA. China also, there's so many things. So what we're talking about here, guys, is the policy of Putin and Xi Jinping. Let's separate those two things. They're very different things. So all my love sa people of Russia, people of China, and of course, at the end of the day, also we're here para sa Pilipinas. God bless and talk to you soon. Ayan, thank you mga troll ha, salamat.